beginning a new series on Kriya Yoga Living, 5 qualities of the awakened heart. And today we begin with the quality of self-restraint. I had for my title, Self-Restraint and the Superconscious Operating System. As I begin this series on Kriya Yoga Living, I thought it would be a good idea to begin by explaining a little bit of what I mean by Kriya Yoga Living. Some of you, of course, are very familiar with the spiritual path of Kriya Yoga and are already living it. But others of you I know are new to it. I think regardless of our amount of time on the path, it can always be useful to reflect on what our path is and how we can live it most effectively. So let's start there. Kriya Yoga is a philosophy and practice for waking up to the spiritual truth of our being and living in harmony with that truth. The goal of this path is self and God realization, the liberation of our consciousness, and that liberation primarily being liberation from the fundamental error of spiritual ignorance that causes all forms of suffering. So this freedom then is freedom that supports a wholesome, healthy, purposeful, serviceful, happy life. So I want to set the foundation by looking at some of the basic principles of Kriya Yoga that then inform how we live. Let's start with the big one, that there is a supremely conscious, there is one supremely conscious absolute reality that is beyond time and space. It is beyond words and thoughts, name or form. It's unchanging, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, invisible, unbounded, unlimited. There is that one reality. And that one reality is the source and the substance of all that is. And it is therefore both beyond, transcendent, beyond the world, and immanent through all the worlds. It supports all of life, but is never constrained or limited by any of it. The omnipresent nature of that reality means that it can appear in infinite ways. Thus, we have the saying from the Vedic seers that there is one truth or one reality called by many names. This allows for the divine to be worshipped in many different ways, many different names and forms, because all of that is recognized as an expression of the one reality. So it's like the one ocean with many waves. The waves have no independent existence. They are really only the ocean waving. I like to think of it that way. So we too have no independent existence. We live and move and have our being in that ultimate reality. And Kriya Yoga is about realizing that truth and then learning to live it. So the question, of course, comes, well, how do we live an awakened life in harmony with this oneness, with this truth of our being, with our interconnection to all of life? How do we fulfill our potential as divine beings? And a question that I have been fascinated with since the beginning, which is, how do we change? How do we change? You know, since childhood, I think many of us can relate to being told to be good. And now we hear that refrain in different ways. You know, if you're on the spiritual path, you hear teachings, which I myself, of course, have told you, if you want love, you must be love. If you want peace, you must first be peace. And we're familiar with Gandhiji's saying, you must be the change that you seek. Now the question comes, but how? So Kriya Yoga gives us insight and tools for this. Kriya Yoga is a path of action. The root Kriya, Sanskrit word, is the same as the root for karma, which means action. So it's not just any action, though, it's specific action. And that is action that is for the purpose of clarifying our awareness, purifying the mental field and the physical body, and sanctifying our life, meaning dedicating our life to higher purpose. So this action that is Kriya Yoga is action for the purpose of union. And I want to specifically say conscious union with God, life lived consciously in harmony with God, because we're not separate from God. We never have been, never will be. It is not possible, but we can be conscious of that or not. So Kriya Yoga is about waking up to that, becoming conscious of it, and then learning how to cooperate with it, to live a soul-guided life instead of an ego-driven life. So Kriya Yoga is not fundamentally about changing what we are. It's about discovering what we are. And that's a marvelous, miraculous, delightful discovery, to discover the truth of what we are. And then the sadhana that we have, the spiritual practices that we have, are about uncovering that which we are, like cleaning off the glass of a lamp so the light can shine through more abundantly. So it's about discovering what we are, uncovering what we are, and then I would say recovering what we are, recovering, restoring the soul life where our inherent divine qualities can freely express. So back to my question, how do we make that shift? How do we curb the lower drives and tendencies, the ego-based reactive nature? How do we overcome that and gain access to our soul qualities like soul, like self-restraint, like humility, compassion, freedom from anger, freedom to love? You know, we're familiar with being overtaken by the lower drives. And so that question is one I think we all have. How do we stay anchored in the soul? Well, there are two approaches to this change that Kriya Yoga offers and really embraces both of those ways of changing. One way is course correction. That means, you know, of course, when we find ourselves saying, doing, thinking in ways that we know are not consistent with the highest truth of our being, we make a course correction. You know, sometimes that's apologizing and changing our behavior. Sometimes we catch it before it comes out of our mouth. All of that is course correction. The other way is transforming the mind where those tendencies arise, transforming the mind through self-realization. And the truth is, we need both. We need both ways. We need to make course corrections, and we need to purify our consciousness. We need to uplift our consciousness. We need to wake up fully so that the light of what we are informs our thoughts, our speech, and our actions. Because if our practice, if our attempts to try and change, or try to overcome the lower drives and tendency, if that practice is focused solely on correction, then change is slow. It's really slow, and we can grow weary. We can become discouraged, and sometimes we can even give up on the spiritual path because it feels that change is too hard, and perhaps we think maybe it's not really even possible for me to change. Paramahansa Yogananda said, by Kriya Yoga, one's consciousness functions on a higher plane. By Kriya Yoga, one's consciousness functions on a higher plane. Devotion to the infinite spirit then arises spontaneously in one's heart. That's so inspiring and encouraging, isn't it? He was referring specifically to the Kriya Yoga technique of superconscious meditation. So although all the other practices and ways of living ethically, truthfully, are a part of it, here he's referring to the importance of superconscious meditation, the practice that facilitates the direct experience of absolute reality and conscious abidance in that divine self. So through steady practice, regular practice of superconscious meditation, the mind is purified and our faculty of discernment is clarified so we can see more clearly what right action is in harmony with that truth of our being. Our intuition is awakened, so we are guided spontaneously from the soul and we spontaneously express our higher potential. We naturally then do what's in harmony with truth. We naturally and spontaneously respond with compassion, with peace, and with love. So here it is. We respond naturally with peace, with compassion, with love, because we are that. The truth of our being is unobscured by ignorance, by error thoughts in the mind. We are transformed, and our illumined consciousness uplifts others around us as well. From this state of consciousness, this higher state of consciousness, being self-contained and non-reactive, is not an effort to overcome the drives of the ego. That's such a relief. Instead, we are operating from a higher plane, from a different point of identification. We are settled in, anchored in the self, and then what is in harmony with that truth of our being spontaneously and naturally arises. This is like a breath of fresh air. I received an email recently from Stephen Ridley, a brother disciple of my guru, Roy Eugene Davis. And Steve was reflecting on what it was like to be in our teacher's presence. He wrote, consciously established in the truth of his being, parentheses, spiritually enlightened, I experienced that as a constant in him. So Steve writes, when he was lighthearted and jovial, his presence was calm. When more seriously focused and intentional, his presence was calm. This constant in him had a beneficial influence on others. His presence blessed. Stephen then wrote about a time when Guruji spoke for his meditation group in Denver. And when Mr. Davis paused for questions, one of the students there asked, Mr. Davis, are you enlightened? Stephen writes that Roy responded, oh, you're not going to ask me that, are you? And the audience laughed. Then he was quiet for a moment, and then he calmly stated, well, I have peace. Stephen concluded his letter with the thought, how many can truly say that? I want to conclude with a reading from the Bhagavad Gita that I hope will wrap this all up, tie it all together. This is from the second chapter, verses 64 to 66. One who is controlled by the self, by self-restraint, attains peace. One who is controlled by the self, and this is capital S self, meaning one who's anchored in the self. One who is controlled by the self, by self-restraint, small s, self-restraint, attains peace. With peace comes the end of all sorrows. For one with a tranquil mind, the intellect becomes steady. When you have a tranquil mind, the intellect becomes steady. No doubt, no wavering, no reaction. With peace comes the end of all sorrows. For one with a tranquil mind, the intellect becomes steady. There is no wisdom for one who is undisciplined, nor is there concentration for one who is uncontrolled. And here it means lacking steadfast meditation practice. There is no wisdom for one who is undisciplined, nor is there concentration for one who is uncontrolled or lacking steadfast meditation practice. In one who does not concentrate, there is no peace. And without peace, how can there be happiness? So I have, of course, one more thing to conclude. It's Valentine's Day, so I think we have to have a poem. And this is from Václav Havel. It is I who must begin. It is I who must begin. Once I begin, once I try here and now, right where I am, not excusing myself by saying things would be easier elsewhere, to live in harmony with the voice of being as I understand it within myself. As soon as I begin that, I suddenly discover to my surprise that I am neither the only one, nor the first, nor the most important one to have set out upon that road. Whether all is really lost or not depends entirely on whether or not I am lost. It is I who must begin. Let us all begin anew now, today. Om. Peace.